APTN InFocus is back, now in podcast form. Over the years, APTN InFocus gave an extended look into stories that needed to be put in focus by panelists and special guests who joined our host in studio. Now, our Winnipeg reporter, Cierra Bettens, will be changing hats and hosting that podcast that will bring you an extended look into stories that are making waves across Turtle Island. Here's a preview of the first episode and our interview with Cierra Bettens.
I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News in Focus. In this week's episode, we're putting the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in focus. To the Gwich'in in Alaska, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is known as Ijikwatsan Gwandai Godlit, meaning the sacred place where life begins.
Our stories as Gwich'in nations have been long told that we never go to this area, and it's defined as a sacred place because that's where life begins. You know, we don't want the life to end there. We want the life to continue to begin and thrive there. And that's of the animals, the birds, and the waterfowl that occupy that area.
Cierra, thanks so much for joining us in studio. My first question is, can you tell us the idea about bringing APTN InFocus and turning it into a podcast?
Yeah, so some of our viewers might remember the name InFocus from our long-standing TV program. So now the idea is we're reviving it as a podcast. And so it's really, keeping the spirit of the original InFocus TV program and bringing in experts, bringing in reporters to give our viewers a bit more of an in-depth look at the stories that we've been sharing in the newscast.
And Cierra, how do you feel about the podcast and how do you think it will capture the stories that are featured on APTN News?
Yeah, so we're really focusing on these developing stories. So there's stories that are making headlines, but they're also evolving, and our reporters are continuing to follow them. So oftentimes these stories are, very complex, and our reporters only really get a few minutes to share them on the newscast. And so with this, we can bring in an expert to give a bit more context, or we can bring in a reporter to share, what they've gathered in the field and what they've heard from people that are most impacted by these stories. And then, so the idea is in turn that our viewers tune into APTN National News with a much more nuanced understanding of these stories and, hopefully feel a bit more connected to the stories.
And Cierra, can you talk about some of the ideas and topics for the first episodes? What are listeners going to expect?
Yeah, so our first episode is on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So for people that aren't familiar, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is a 19.6 million acre refuge in Alaska. And it holds a lot of cultural significance to the Gwich'in in Alaska. But with Trump's return to power, there's heightened concerns about his plans to open it up to oil and gas drilling. So our reporter, Sarah Connors, has been following the story really closely over the past couple months. So we brought her in on the podcast to give viewers a bit more background and, talk about what's at stake, what she's been hearing from Indigenous communities that are affected by these issues. So super excited for that to come out. And yeah, we also have an episode on organized crime with our reporter, Kenneth Jackson, coming out. And so, yeah, cannot wait for our viewers to hear about that.
Definitely creating more value for our viewers, for our listeners, and creating this more content. And you have much more time, and that's important, more time to cover it compared to what we do here where we only have half an hour for our show.
Yeah, absolutely. That's totally the idea behind it. And yeah, just so our viewers, can understand and work through and navigate these really complex issues and feel, a lot more connected to the stories that we tell.
And finally, when does the first episode drop and where can everyone listen?
Yeah, so the first episode actually just dropped on Thursday. It's available on all major streaming platforms. So wherever you get your podcasts, you can also listen to it on aptnnews.ca/podcasts. And I also just wanted to give a shout out to our producers, Mark Blackburn, Charmaine Straker, our editor, Jesse Andrusko. They've all been doing amazing work to make this podcast a reality.
That's our reporter, Cierra Bettens, who is the host of APTN InFocus and our new podcast there. Thank you, Cierra, for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Kristen.